In the 1930s, Manila, capital of the Philippines, 5,000 miles by air from Hawaii and another 2,400 from San Francisco, is this country's chief oriental outpost. When the United States first occupied the islands during the Spanish-American War, they harbored 7 million persons and were so remote from our consciousness that Finley Peter Dunn's Mr. Dooley remarked that most Americans didn't know whether the Philippines was a place or something to eat. By the 1930s, the population has more than doubled, and Americans are so aware of their far-flung ward's existence and its rich natural resources that they have invested over $200 million in the region. American influences are apparent throughout its everyday life. For all Filipinos, there is a single political goal: independence. In 1934, the American Congress, in a significant departure from big power colonialism in Asia, pledges independence for the Philippines by 1946. Some Filipinos favor waiting for self-government until their country is politically mature. Others want to go it alone immediately. Leader of the country's major party, Manuel Quezon, elected first president when the Philippines achieved Commonwealth status in 1934. Quezon promptly asked the help of a retired soldier to whose father the Filipino president once surrendered his sword after an abortive insurrection. For Douglas MacArthur, who brings along a promising young staff officer, it is his third trip to the islands. As a field marshal in the Philippine Army, MacArthur conceives a 10-year plan for the defense of the Philippines. He has relatively few men to work with. Their training is still far from complete in 1941, when MacArthur becomes commander of United States forces in the Far East. Much of his tiny air force, whether through surprise or carelessness, historians still cannot agree, is destroyed before it leaves the ground. December 26th, to spare Manila, MacArthur proclaims it an open city. Manila is nonetheless uneasy, and with good cause, for the Japanese ignore the proclamation. Japanese ground forces have already landed, first on December 10th at the north of Luzon, Manila's island. Then at Legazpi, Mindanao, Lingayen Gulf, Palawan, the Visayas, and central Luzon. For undermanned American and Filipino defenders, there remains only the forlorn hope of falling back on 2 strongholds, Bataan and Corregidor. On March 12th, under orders from President Roosevelt, MacArthur heads for Australia. Before leaving, he swears a memorable prophetic oath.
I shall return. Nothing is more certain than the ultimate reconquest and liberation from the enemy of those and adjacent lands. I repeat, I shall return.
Courage alone cannot sustain a combat soldier. On April 9th, Bataan falls and the infamous death march begins for 35,000 enfeebled American and Filipino captives. These Japanese pictures show only its start and not its ghastly consequences. With Bataan under heel, the Japanese concentrate on Corregidor. Every inch of this 5-square-mile island fortress is raked with bombs. The Japanese besiege Corregidor not only from the air, but also with artillery from Cavite and Bataan. Huddled like moles in the Malinta tunnel are soldiers, some of them wounded, Filipino government officials, doctors, and ill-equipped nurses, all awaiting the inevitable. On May 6, 1942, the Japanese finally set foot on Corregidor, and that proud fortress falls. To the Japanese General Homa, the American defeat is a glorious occasion. To the Filipinos, surrender means that independence must now wait for liberation. To MacArthur Wainwright, it is a bitter moment, but he has capitulated, in his words, with broken heart and head bowed in sadness, but not in shame. Manila under the Japanese. Annoying a soldier of the occupation is punishable by death. Many Filipinos take to the outlying hills as guerrillas. To those who remain home, the Japanese quickly demonstrate their endorsement of the age-old adage that to the victor belongs the spoils. Some of the loot, especially sugar and coconut oil, is hard to dispose of. The other countries in the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, of which the Philippine Islands is shortly to be dubbed a full-fledged member, aren't prosperous enough to buy. No matter, the Japanese appropriate it anyway. Under the Japanese, the Filipinos eat frugally, but their conquerors dare not let them starve. Often the Japanese accompany their meager handouts with high praise for the virtues of austerity. Where once Americans figured importantly in the economy of the islands, Japanese move in. One step they take is to authorize the seizure of property belonging to enemy aliens. To simplify things, it is assumed that all property belongs to enemy aliens. Trying to smooth the course of their occupation, the Japanese institute what they call a policy of attraction. Their skilled propagandists work hard to put their best face forward, aided by their control of all channels of communication. Like many an occupying power, The Japanese appreciate the value of indoctrinating their subjects while they're young. Filipinos of all ages are told they have achieved independence, but it is a sham independence made in Japan. Quezon has fled to Washington. Puppet leaders friendly to Tokyo take over the island government. Most Filipinos hold them in contempt, but not openly. After all, they control the distribution of rice. There are the usual slogans and along with them the usual parades. Native collaborators and Axis nationals make a show of solidarity. Not every nationality is represented in the parades. In 8 internment camps throughout the islands, thousands of Allied prisoners, mostly American, British, and Dutch, struggle to stay alive. Their food, they never see meat, arrives in the same garbage cans used to haul away the Japanese trash. The difference in quality is slight. To amuse themselves, the captives give their huts names like Frothy Bottom and Glamourville. There's little news from the outside world in Glamourville. Its residents hardly dare believe the rumors that seep through, that MacArthur from the Southwest Pacific and the Navy from the South and Central Pacific already have moved far along the road back to Manila. At a Honolulu conference in July 1944, a fateful choice is posed to President Roosevelt, MacArthur, and Admiral Chester Nimitz. Should the next objective, after the Solomons, after New Guinea, after the Gilbert Islands, be Formosa or the Philippines? The decision is made. MacArthur's pledge will be fulfilled. The next strike will be at the Philippines. First target, Leyte, then once that beachhead is secured, to hit Lingayen Gulf and Mindoro. The ultimate objectives, Manila, Bataan, Corregidor. October 20th, 1944. After MacArthur's own dramatic return at Leyte, 8 months of fighting lie ahead. But now the story is different. In Leyte Gulf, Admiral William Hull's ships have crippled the Japanese fleet, and American air power, humbled 3 years earlier, comes roaring back into its own. Near some of the beaches, the welcome is effusive and deceptively carefree. But the American casualty figures of the Leyte campaign alone, 3,500 killed, 12,000 wounded, attest to the fierceness of the fighting in the jungles beyond the shore. In Luzon, as on Leyte earlier, the avenging soldiers can pause only briefly to accept the homage of the Filipinos they free. For beyond this village is another, and beyond a multitude of villages, all pointing toward victory. January 30th, 1945. 25 miles behind the Japanese lines, American Rangers liberate more than 500 survivors of the Death March and Corregidor. The next goal is Manila. Japanese suicide squads hold the city. The streets are mined. The people flee as best they can. The battle for Manila lasts a month. When it is over, much of the wounded city has been put to the torch. Before the flames have dwindled, the people of Manila start returning to their broken homes. Bataan reverts to Allied hands. And at Corregidor on March 2nd, 1945, nearly 3 years after his hasty evacuation, a solemn, triumphant MacArthur keeps his promise to return.
I see that the old flagstaff still stands. Have your troops hoist the colors to its peak, and let no enemy ever haul them down.
On July 4th, 1946, America keeps its promise. In a formal proclamation, President Truman recognizes the independence of the Philippines as a separate and self-governing nation. Freedom for the Philippines becomes a reality in the 20th century.